Hi, good afternoon, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Arab's event series, Race to Resilience. Thank you for being here in person with us at the Arab Singapore office. And to our online audience, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. And without further ado, I know you'd like to hear from our speakers very quickly, so I'd like to invite our first speaker to give us a welcome address, Mr. Poya Rasiki. He is our energy, water and resources leader for Arab in Australasia. Poya, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and our online audience, and very well welcome to Arab's Race to Resilience Asia event series, and especially this one held here today in Singapore. This series is endorsed by the UNFCCC Climate Champions and supports a UN campaign which aims to catalyze step change in global ambition to build resilience for 4 billion people by 2030. COP27 is in less than a week. One of the key milestones is moving from mitigation to adaptation, and we hope that nations will work together to define a global goal and translate it into measurable outcomes, particularly around three key themes. The first being decarbonisation of cities, the second being sustainable energy, and the third being resilience. So today our event is around hydrogen as a resilient energy carrier, and our speakers will deep dive into challenges and areas of opportunity for both Singapore and Asia. And you know, hydrogen is a growing topic, and especially in the last 3 to 4 years. When I was a student, we spoke about hydrogen as the hydrogen economy by the year 2050. So, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s, I'm giving away my age, but we used to think, how is that even possible? But it's amazing to see that we're actually on the way to that milestone. It also reminds me of where the solar PV industry was in 2005 or thereabouts, where it was on the cusp of actually being transformed. 5 years later, solar became a part of the fabric of the energy ecosystem. So I think hydrogen is moving fast towards that. We heard at the recent announcement in Siu from Singapore Deputy PM Wong, who announced the National Hydrogen Strategy for Singapore, and he spoke about 5 key thrusts to move hydrogen forward. Among them were the need for enabling infrastructure for hydrogen to thrive. And he also mentioned ammonia as a potential carrier for maritime bunkering. So it's such statements and such commitment from governments like Singapore and others, and the funding that goes behind it, that will actually make hydrogen a reality in the future. So we have a distinguished set of speakers here this afternoon. We've got our moderator, Lauren Sorkin, who's the Executive Director of Resilient Cities Network. Lauren leads global efforts in 100 cities to deal with climate change. We have Fiona Lee from BP, Hydrogen Commercial Advisor. And Fiona is part of the gas and low carbon energy team here in Singapore, and is responsible for driving business development of hydrogen for BP across Asia Pacific region. We have Sid Srivastava, Head of New Energies and Resources Asia, Deputy General Manager from Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation. And last but not least, we've got Thomas Brio, who's our Southeast Asia Energy Advisory Leader at Arab. He's got 20 years experience in low carbon energy and sustainable energy solutions. Before I hand over to Thomas, I'd like to just thank British Chamber of Commerce as one of 30 strategic partners in supporting this effort, and also their contribution and the call for climate change. Thank you very much. I hand over to Thomas.
Thanks, Poya. Welcome everyone. Thanks to some of you to coming here in person. It's nice to see you here, and welcome to everyone online. I'm going to assume that most of you know something about hydrogen, so I'm not going to patronize you with the hydrogen 101 of green versus blue. But what I did want to talk to you about is something a little bit more specific and perhaps relevant to Singapore, which is how we actually get hydrogen into the country, which is perhaps slightly different from hydrogen economy more globally, worldwide, given that Singapore is kind of, well, it's geographically isolated with very limited renewable resource. And I guess that puts it in a kind of common ground with other geographically isolated or renewable poor countries such as Korea, Japan, Taiwan, perhaps. So I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about some of the challenges associated with different types of carriers that could bring hydrogen into the country and what the alternatives to those are. So these are three of the potential carriers that could bring hydrogen into the country. So we could liquefy hydrogen, we could bring ammonia in, or we could create a liquid organic, and they each have their own challenges. And I guess one of the key things to think about is where the energy penalty is associated with that. So if you take the green bar on the left-hand side of each of these diagrams, that's perhaps the renewable electricity that you would generate in country, let's say in a renewable rich location. It is, for example, twice as sunny in Australia per square kilometre, and it is going to take many square kilometres to supply Singapore with green electricity and fuels. And then we have some challenges associated with conversion into various different fuels. So creation of or splitting of water into hydrogen. It's probably only about 60 or 70% efficient currently. We're hoping that could improve, but already you are now in the territory where hydrogen pays a higher energy penalty than liquefied natural gas, which is the alternative, right? But then you've got to convert that into a shippable fuel. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, but it is also very small and very light and disappears really easily if you don't control it very tightly. So it is not very energy dense per unit volume, and therefore it's best piped. And I guess gas is best piped generally, Ukraine aside, and I think the LNG market has grown quite significantly since then. But if you want to create a shippable fuel, you really need to create something which is more volume dense. So you can liquefy it, but that requires you to get it down to near 0 Kelvin, which takes a lot of energy, so you lose another 30% or so. But you could create ammonia, which is another option, or you could create a liquid organic. And actually the creation of a liquid organic is relatively efficient. The cracking of the liquid organic, so out of the original element here, is relatively inefficient. So by the time you get to the end of the chain, you are left with about 20 to 30% of the energy. So that means it's going to cost, never mind the infrastructure, 3 to 5 times what the renewable electricity cost you originally. Now, renewable electricity can be produced very efficiently. As I said, it's twice as sunny in places like Chile and Australia, and the land is very cheap and not covered in rainforest. So perhaps there's some reasons why you would do that. But the energy penalty is quite severe. So why would you ever consider hydrogen is the question. Well, it's a good storable fuel. You can store it for long periods of time. And the alternatives really are to pipe it or to transmit it via electric cable. Now, some of you have heard about sun cable, and in fact we'll hear a little bit in a moment on AREH, which originally started as a cable project, but for a variety of reasons has converted to a liquid hydrogen or a hydrogen project, and and I guess it really comes down to distance, right? So it's 4,200 kilometers from Australia to Singapore across the Timor Trench, which is 2 kilometers deep. So that's quite a challenge for an interconnector and a pipeline, but the energy loss is significantly less. So the question really comes down to choosing those different carriers if you are in an isolated location like Singapore from your renewable resource, or in Japan, and choosing it very carefully. So, you know, ammonia has some strong advantages in that, and as Poya pointed out, Lawrence Wong mentioned ammonia in his strategy for the shipping industry, and perhaps, and there's a number of activities ongoing with hydrogen, with direct ammonia firing in CCGT. Liquid hydrogen, however, may be more appropriate for aviation, so that's got some advantages. However, both of them have some significant safety concerns associated with them, and that's why liquid organics is also in the race. And I think it's a race that's only just started. It's perhaps a race that won't end up with one winner. And I think at that point, I might hand over to Fiona to talk to you a little bit about AREH and what the oil and gas industry are doing around the choice of hydrogen carriers.
Thanks, Thomas. First, I would like to thank everyone for attending this event, those virtually, physically, and Arup for the invitation. Just giving a bit of introduction of myself. I'm Fiona from BP, looking at hydrogen origination and customer engagement efforts. And my focus area is mainly in Southeast Asia, including Singapore. For me, my career started actually in the heavier and in the resilient hydrocarbon space as I slowly inch towards the lighter end of the barrel, and right now in the lightest end, right, in hydrogen. Definitely because I do see much promise and I have faith that this industry will grow and will aid in the energy transition globally. I mean, as things stand, right, BP analysis shows that hydrogen could have around 8% share in final energy consumption by 2050. And that number could simply double when we factor in additional hydrogen demand to generate electricity and to produce fuels such as ammonia, methanol, and synthetic jet fuel. So to put that into context, that's generally equivalent to the natural gas market today. And just 5 years from now, our estimates show that hydrogen industry could be worth in the region of 290 billion. So that's around 100 billion more than in 2020. It's a huge number. It's an exciting industry. Over the course of the next few decades, we will definitely see an increasing electrification of the energy system. As this takes place, we do see that hydrogen can offer a reliable role by providing energy to activities which are difficult or costly to electrify, including high-temperature processes in industry and long-distance transportation. In terms of in the transportation sector-wise, the more obvious ones are the long-distance transportation, especially in marine and aviation. Marine-wise, form of ammonia, possibly methanol, synthetic diesel, these are possible options, and therefore add on to the complication of decarbonisation at scale. Aviation, Thomas mentioned liquefied hydrogen. We're also looking at sustainable aviation fuel, synthetic jet fuel, as possible decarbonisation pathway. We're looking at the production of this hydrogen derivative accounts for around 75 to 80% of the hydrogen used within the transport sector by 2050, according to our net zero forecast. The remainder would be largely heavy duty, road transport, and to some extent, rail. By 2050, we do see that, hydrogen will count for around 5 to 15% of total final energy used by the transport sector. And if you forget all the statistics, just remember that hydrogen has a key role to play in hard-to-abate, energy-intensive sectors. That's really the key. Now, let me start by sharing a bit more on what BP is doing in this part of in the hydrogen space. Given that I'm here on this platform, let me share a bit more on what BP aims to do. We aim to be a net zero company by 2050. And on hydrogen space, 10% of the low carbon hydrogen market in key geographies by 2030. And we're actively, definitely growing this portfolio, keeping our hands and legs busy. We are already actively developing actually 11 low carbon hydrogen projects. And in Asia Pacific, let me talk about 3 projects that we are excited about. Thomas mentioned the Asia Renewable Energy Hub project, and that's indeed a project that we have recently just closed only in September. Yes, the news was out much earlier. But it was closed most recently, and we completed acquisition of the 40.5% equity stake in Asia Renewable Energy Hub, where we will be the operator along with our partners, Macquarie Capital, ICE, and CWP. That is a huge, immense hydrogen project. It has the potential to produce around 1.6 million tonnes of hydrogen, or equivalent to 9 million tonnes of green ammonia, but annually by 2050. Of course, it will be developed in phases. This has the potential to be one of the largest renewable project and hydrogen production project globally. And that is definitely a cornerstone in helping us to achieve what our customer wants in achieving their net zero target. Apart from Asia Renewable Energy Hub, there's just one of it in Australia, we have also development in Midwest, in Geraldton. And most recently, just last month, we have been also awarded land by the Western Australia government, quite a fair bit in the Oakajee Strategic Industrial Area to progress the project development. We have completed a feasibility study, and it's in the next stage of project development. And of course, there's also Kwinana at Green Energy Hub, where we are looking at transforming our existing refinery base into a green energy hub, also with a hydrogen angle to it, with a 75 megawatt scale electrolyzer. Summing up, you have heard a lot about how useful the promises of hydrogen, how useful it can be, and what we plan to do as BP in this space. I definitely believe that a journey of 1,000 miles begins today. There has been a lot of activities by government, by industries, by end users in this space. And certainly the hydrogen industry can only be successful with partnerships across the value chains as players line up to work together to achieve net zero. Thank you. Let me pass on to Sid.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Siddharth, and tough act to follow BP 9 million ton per annum ammonia project. But to put that together, obviously, you need lots of capital. And I think probably BP is well placed to put lots of that capital, but there are so many ammonia, hydrogen projects being talked about. And all of them are looking at capital or financing. So as a banker, let me deconstruct what will differentiate the successful hydrogen projects from the others. Now, when we are financing a hydrogen project or any commodity project for that reason, and we are trying to finance it based on its own viability, then basically as lenders, what we are looking at is how confident are we on the long-term future cash flows of that project. And because we are basically financing those. And when we are the senior debtors, we need to be highly confident. If you are a high-yield investor, you need to be reasonably confident. If you're an equity investor, maybe mildly or but I think the degree of how confident you are is where I think different set of investors sit. And I will probably highlight today 3 key aspects where bankers and the financiers are going to focus on when they are looking at financing these projects. So when I look at certainty of future cash flow, I think the first key issue today is capturing demand. I think we have seen lots of large announcements around a lot of big ammonia projects, hydrogen projects. But where is this hydrogen going? I think there is a great and big announcement in the SEU. Prior to that, I think Japan was the place to be, and everybody was looking at Japan, Korea, as where the hydrogen and ammonia will go. Now, if you look at the numbers, METI's 2030 target for ammonia import into Japan is 3 million ton per annum. 3 million ton per annum of ammonia is 540,000 KTPA of hydrogen. That's only 500,000 ton. That's probably third of, I don't know, that's 1/3 of your project. And most of the large scale projects being announced today are 1 MTPA hydrogen or 600, 800 KTPA hydrogen. So entire demand of the Japanese ammonia demand is potentially less than the single large project announcement. So not each of these announced projects can succeed unless they are able to capture the demand. And that to us is a critical ask, that are the volumes being placed? Are these projects coming up with players who can actually take up? And what is the resilience of demand? Is this the short-term demand, or is it a sticky long-term demand? Are the countries investing in the import infrastructure? Is the supply chain being built? Is there an economic viable case for import of hydrogen in these countries and economies? So that's one. And the second issue, I think, that comes with it, and I think that's a pretty hot topic in hydrogen industry, is at what price you want to get this hydrogen out. Because if I go back to my reasonable confidence around the cash flows, it has to be volume into price. And the price is becoming a real issue because of, again, limited economic use cases of hydrogen today. And what I like to call the first mover disadvantage. Because everybody is showing a graph, I think Arab didn't do it today, but I think every graph, the hydrogen prices are going down. And if hydrogen prices are going down, there is no reason for you to buy it today. You can wait to buy it tomorrow or day after tomorrow because it's more economic. And I think there are leaders, are hydrogen industry leaders who are trying to get into early contracts, but not necessarily long-term contracts. So they are willing to be the sector leaders or try to get a certain amount of quantity. But I think what's missing is the longevity and what should be the pricing. And I think that's the second area, a successful project or a platform, as I like to call, will differentiate with something else. Because at certain capex, because for a hydrogen project, most of the capex will go in today, your cost base is fixed. So if you want to have your clients with you for a longer period, them to sign on a longer term deal, it has to come in phases, and it has to be able to bring down the prices and able to basically pass on the capex advantage of future phases to your early clients. Again, this is something which industry has to figure out. I mean, oil industry never needed long-term contracts to finance. Gas did. Hydrogen may or may not. But I think what each of them had and what we need is probably the stickiness on demand and the price formula which is transparent and which is viable. And this brings me to the third point. I think we focus a lot on the contract, demand, supply. And something which I see is the technical issues, which are not necessarily focused on a lot. But for bankers who have been financing 60, 70% of these projects, there's a bit of a nervousness around it. And the reason why I bring it out is I was reading this article, and I think it was a BNF study which came out with the largest operating electrolyzer today installed and operating is 6.5 megawatt. And for a 1 MTPA hydrogen project, you need 20 gigawatt electrolyzer. There's 3,000 times the scale up. Every time I look at that number, that's enormous. Anything you have to scale up 3,000 times is bound to go wrong, and it's bound to hit the capital, cash flows, and will impact the certainty of cash flow. So I think those challenges, the challenges around this tech replacement, I think there's so much focus around green hydrogen, but green hydrogen is also intermittent hydrogen, which will have its impact obviously on the electrolyzer degradation. And I always think about it, I talk to my team and at other platforms, if I have to, 20 or 30-year project, I have to replace electrolyzer 3 times instead of 2 times, the economics just go out of way. So I think these are some of the risks which can be dealt with by the financially. I think so the winning projects or projects which succeed in getting the financing would also need to do a certain bit of financial engineering, because we cannot wait for 7 to 10 years to do due diligence and figure out what works and what does not work. So we probably need to think of these scenarios, identify these scenarios, and get the banks comfortable that, look, that nervous capital can go in and need not be as nervous as it was on day one. So maybe I'll pause here. I think these were the three key issues. There's a host of issues, but I think if we can solve for these three, probably we are almost 75% there. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sid. And now I'd like to pass the floor to Lauren Sorkin, Executive Director of the Resilient Cities Network.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Sorkin. It's very nice to be here for this event. Thanks to Arup for the invitation, and to the speakers before for their insights. And thanks to all of you for joining and sharing your time with us. You might wonder why City Network is interested in hydrogen. And that really comes back to the DNA of the Resilient Cities Network and what it is that we do. Resilient Cities Network is the largest and oldest network of cities who are working on holistic resilience. So we help cities to think about how they can plan for economic, environmental, and social stresses and shocks that they will face. And from the beginning of our work, we have been working together with Arup on strategic planning frameworks for cities, and we continue to do work arm in arm with our nearly 100 member cities around the world. We have 20 in Asia and the Pacific, Singapore being one of them, so it's really a pleasure to be speaking to everyone from Singapore today. So how do we actually get cities to build resilience? How do we achieve this? We really work in three different ways with lots of different partners. First, we empower cities with tools and resources that they need. We work on multi-city programs with them on specific areas of need. And then we mobilize resilient impact funds for them to catalyze change. And therein lies the interest in energy and the connection to this renewable energy discussion and hydrogen today. Of the issues that cities prioritize as their top concerns, climate change and inadequate infrastructure top the list. And so we work with cities in a dedicated way on energy resilience and their energy transition. And actually, last year, around this time at COP26, we released a white paper with Arup on distributed renewable energy that talks about many different options for cities to build resilience. Now, hydrogen, as we've heard today, has some really exciting aspects and also some challenges in terms of getting it to our cities. But for cities who have limited space, limited access to renewables, there are interesting questions to ask. And one of the most important things about building resilience is the quality of building resilience. And what I would say about that is that it has two seemingly issues that are at odds, but actually they're totally joined up. And that is, building resilience must be done with urgency. We have to do it now because climate impacts are here, but we also have to do it with a long-term mindset. So we have to look at options that are going to be built in over time. So with that, I want to transition to the panel part of this discussion. So I want to welcome the speakers to come up with me to the stage. So thanks for joining again. I want to start off with a question for our whole panel, and perhaps we'll come to you first on it, Thomas, and then we can go down the line. But we're living right now in a very high oil price context driven by a number of factors. With that on the scene, with that backdrop, what do you think the industries are that can really benefit from considering hydrogen in terms of transition? And where do you see the more immediate opportunities?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I wrote an article some time ago that actually we transition away from fossil fuels when the fossil fuel price is low, not when it's high, because the fossil fuel industry then can't invest in exploration. So there's an interesting dichotomy there. But one thing that does become clear is obviously, and as everyone will have noticed from their energy bills here in Singapore, is the gas price has gone up and their bills have gone up. And green hydrogen, at least, is completely separated from that in the sense that it would be generated using renewable energy resource and then kind of bypass that supply chain. So I think there are some ways in which hydrogen looks more attractive as the oil price stays high. I think also what has happened with Ukraine and with Russia is that single pipeline, that single point of failure, if you like, or geopolitical issue, has kind of put the alternative to hydrogen, certainly for Singapore, of interconnectors, back on the kind of question of, do we really want to be doing point-to-point stuff, or do you want a resilient supply resource? And I guess hydrogen is, in a sense, that diverse supply. If it doesn't work out in Chile, then you can get it from Qatar. If it doesn't work out in Qatar, you'll get it from Australia, etc. So I think there's some interesting reasons why hydrogen can take advantage of the current situation.
Do you want to add to that, Fiona?
Yeah, sure, concur with many points, right? I mean, it does adds to the momentum from government agencies, governments globally, in looking at alternative fuel source to address the current high price gas environment or energy environment. But certainly, as we look at energy bills, right? I mean, we certainly don't make a capex decision based on 2-3 years of high prices. So that's also at the back of our mind. We're also quite very aware that yes, energy bill is significantly higher this few years. But as we look at the long-term supply curve, we also do see that supplies will start building up as the high price environment would help to incentivize more production. But at the same time, we are confident that with the many net zero commitment, it will remind the government that, okay, to prevent a repeat of what's happening today, to diversify and to look at alternative sources like hydrogen, like blue solution.
So we want to create more supply. We want to have a supply diversity, and that creates resilience. Sid, you spoke about projects, ones that are going to be more successful than others. You obviously will deal with many different types of clients. What kinds of industries do you see as really getting to take advantage of this, maybe not first mover, because you've said that can be a disadvantage, but this next wave of investment in hydrogen? What do you think, where do you think the pressure points are?
I think the most obvious industries which should benefit from it or should take advantage are fertilizer and refining. And for most obvious reason that you don't need new infrastructure. These two industries are using the existing 7 MTPA of hydrogen production, which is grey, which is coming from natural gas. And once natural gas prices have gone higher, and especially in refining, actually adding hydrogen or using clean hydrogen, which is still expensive, does not add to the end product price significantly. So to me, these two sectors are probably the most obvious ones which should try and look at their decarbonization targets and move towards it. And I think beyond that, I think there's just enormous focus on the generation market. And I think there are interesting experiments happening around the world. I think Japan is focused also on co-burning ammonia. I think there's a fair bit of focus on blending hydrogen and in the turbines together with gas or pure hydrogen burning. So I think just the momentum, I think, which Fiona was talking about in power sector should get some of the move there.
Yeah, I want to open that question up to the other panelists as well. But before I do, I just want to remind everyone that there's a QR code. You can ask questions, so you can send them to me, and I will theoretically get them on this mobile and ask them. So, okay, so any other industries that we're not thinking about that will be able to move into this area and take advantage of hydrogen as they decarbonize?
I mean, I would agree. I think fertilizer and ammonia is a big thing, and it's an industry that already exists, right? So one can imagine that there might be some companies that move into the market and decide to produce that green ammonia because there is already a demand for ammonia in fertilizer, which doesn't exist in so many other places. But I think there are some other potential markets that we might look at. We've talked about shipping and aviation. I think those are interesting industries to consider. I think, there is, on Jurong Island here, some heavy industries that use hydrogen. And I guess we use hydrogen in the gas network here already for cooking. It's 50% hydrogen, and so replacing it with green hydrogen as opposed to the grey hydrogen, where the CO2 is merely emitted, is another thing. And that is a much bigger industry, perhaps in Europe, where you have heating and where you have a need for seasonal storage. And so there's, in the UK, for example, the peak heating demand is 6 times the peak electrical demand. So you can't heat everyone's home very easily using electricity. So I think the heating market is something being looked at in the UK. So yeah, I think there are a number of different spaces where it might be very significant.
So to get to these spaces, I guess we have to talk more about the numbers. And so a question for you, Sid, is what do you think the price of hydrogen needs to come down to make this possible?
Yes, and there's never a right answer to this question. I mean, it's...
They're going to quote you about that.
I think
Someone's going to tweet it.
You really need to look at what hydrogen is replacing in which market. So I think it becomes a significant question. I like to call it's a 3-variable equation, because you need to look at industry, you need to look at country, and you need to look at what is the certification. We don't discuss certification enough, but I think there would be certain countries which can actually access blue hydrogen and will certify that as clean hydrogen, which then becomes the benchmark you have to meet. So to me, I think these 3 variables define it. I would basically like to believe that, I think right now the numbers I have seen, and again, I'm not into project development, so I can probably say it, but they are somewhere around $4 to $6 for clean hydrogen. I think they were much lower, 2.5 to 3 again for blue hydrogen. That was prior to gas becoming more precious than diamond these days. But I would basically say that the number works at different level, and I think even at $2 to $3, there would be a market for a short term for a right industry. What I think more than what price it needs to fall down, I think the right question is what kind of government support can some of these industries actually benefit? I think IRA is a great step in US, I think, and we probably would see again on the fertilizer or in the steel sector, similar government mandated support coming in certain countries. And once that is there, I think probably it won't be a question of what is the right price level, but I think it's, are we willing to replace the existing price with the tax rebates or the subsidies? So sorry, I didn't want to put out a number, but it's a complex.
Well, you gave us a lot to think about there, and I think you highlighted the issue of government subsidies or incentives, and I think there's a lot to talk about there, especially with the climate conference next week. What's going to be that right trajectory, and can the carbon markets play a role in this? Thomas, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, one thing that we hadn't really talked so much about is perhaps green steel. If you take Australia, for example, they have a huge trade surplus, and the vast majority of that is gas, coal, and iron ore being by far their biggest export, 120 billion or something. So, and the point is the European carbon border mechanism, brackets, they tell us it's not a tax, but really it is, could actually be quite a significant price driver for Australia to stop shipping bulk fuels, because they have to pay for the embodied carbon associated with sending it to Europe, and they have to pay for the shipping fuel used to get it there. And so that could quite significantly increase the price, and so that might then change some of Australia's approach to how it does it. When I talked about shipping hydrogen, the huge inefficiencies are in the shipping, in the conversion to an energy carrier. Can you use the hydrogen directly in the creation of green steel and then ship something to Europe which is entirely green and doesn't pay a tax? The Australians don't want to give away all that money to a European market. They want to keep it in their own market. So I think it's about the right mechanism, not only the price, that drives a whole market to change.
So if you're looking at your balance sheet, sitting in a place that is having lots of land, can generate green hydrogen, you're going to think twice about sending fossil fuels across the ocean, especially if it's going into Europe, because you're going to get hit twice with price increases. And if you can produce something green at home, ship that out, it might be much higher value. Coming back to the issue of carriers and fuels, in terms of the different industries, aviation, shipping, do we see any leaders there? And do you anticipate that one industry will move quicker than others when it comes to adopting hydrogen?
I mean, in this case, right, I mean, if talking about vectors, I mean, currently it's still, I mean, there's pros and cons with every vectors type. I mean, looking at liquid organic carrier, ammonia, liquefied hydrogen, these are promising carriers for long-distance transportation of hydrogen. Do see that, I mean, there's still a huge debate out there. For us, we do see that different industries will look at different carrier type based on an application. There's no hard and fast rule or direct answer to this that, okay, eventually you'll be an ammonia future or you'll be a liquefied hydrogen future. It could potentially be a multi-carrier vector type future. And as we develop our project, we do have that in mind and do work very closely with customers to determine the vectors of choice or even multiple vectors of choice. In terms of different industry-wise, we do see that some industry have highlighted interest in one over the other. For example, for shipping, do see that the industry is gravitating towards ammonia, e-methanol, led by a few major industry players. There's no, again, I mean, it's not that the industry will gravitate towards the best carrier with the highest energy content, right? At the end of the day, it's really what the industry is moving towards. There's many examples in the past on how the best solution isn't the solution. And with that, I mean, that's for shipping, transportation. We do see that for power sector, there is the interest in ammonia, especially for coal firing. And of course, I mean, as most of the OEM who testify that they could do a hydrogen blend to the gas CCGT, but again, 100% gas turbine is still under development. Getting pure hydrogen across the ocean is not also a straightforward solution. So do see this conversation evolving as we develop this market. There's always also that liquefied hydrogen camp, right? As we look at solution that requires hydrogen in its purest form. It could be in the mobility market. It could be some chemical processes, green steel, that require hydrogen in its purest form. So we do see that for various industries, there's different needs. At the end of the day, it really much depends on how the technology will evolve, as well as the cost parity as towards 2030.
I want to ask one more question, but before I do, I want to, in full transparency, say that I cannot get the Slido to work. So if you have a burning question, we might just do it the old-fashioned way and raise your hand after this question, and we'll try to get it working on the phone at the same time. So I want to bring it back to Singapore and the local market in ASEAN. What kinds of policies would we need? We talked about IRA in the US, we talked about European incentives in Australia. What would it take to really get the market going in Singapore and APAC? Sid, I see you nodding. Do you want to take that first?
No, there can be a long wish list. I think we can spend a lot of time. But I think what I would say that there's huge potential also on the production side in Asia, which has not necessarily been in focus. So, but I would say if there is a more government focus on basically giving, first of all, I think it has to be tax holidays. You know, green hydrogen projects which have renewable energy production as well as then connecting to the electrolyzers. There are certain markets where you will get taxed twice, once in the renewable energy production and then once you get into the hydrogen value chain. So you obviously need that clarity in the tax structure. But I would say what would be the best in this region is domestic consumption, if that can be promoted. because I think for successful production projects to really take place, they cannot necessarily be fully export-oriented. So domestic consumption, I think, whether it's in the fertilizer space, because in a lot of Asia, I think fertilizers do have subsidies, and you are passing it on to the farmers. So I think that's a very obvious space where government subsidies can come in, which can help bring green hydrogen production. I think blending mandates, we talked about the town gas or gas coming in. I think that would be very helpful. And any kind of manufacturing benefits, I think we have like PLI scheme in India or any other manufacturing benefits, to also basically, to bring down really the renewable costs, you have to bring down the PV solar cell manufacturing and the module costs. And a lot of time you may not be able to compete with China, but having those local industries could actually help bringing down the cost, which is otherwise 100% import-oriented. So I think those are the three key areas where I think policy can help both production and consumption.
I mean, adding on to Sid's point, right? I mean, government's support is definitely required to unlock sustained demand, as well as potential new incremental supply in this part of the world. But we do also see that for this hydrogen sector, huge amount of infrastructure is required on the logistics supply chain to enable significant imports of this new product. Apart from that, I think was mentioned certification. That would be great if there would be alignment of certification. Say a molecule produced in Australia could be similarly certified in, say, Singapore. And understand that Singapore government has also embarked on such initiative, inking many MOUs with other governments, especially announced during the course of the Seal Week. And that's certainly an area to look out for.
And while I don't want to pick any one policy to choose from, I think there are a number of different mechanisms that we could. But one thing that's absolutely necessary is long-term certainty. You know, some of these projects are proper mega projects. In fact, they're collections of mega projects, and that is going to require a lot of money. And in order to secure that money from people like Sid and his colleagues, you know, there's going to need to be some certainty of those tax rebates lasting, or those blending requirements lasting for a long period of time. And if there's one thing that Singapore is really quite renowned for, it's long-term planning and putting in place a strategy that lasts for a good long time. So I think that gives Singapore an advantage over perhaps some of its local neighbours, and an opportunity to be leaders in the bunkering industry, in the aviation industry, and potentially also in the hydrogen power generation industry. I think, you know, in terms of transport, local land transport, Singapore's small and flat, so, you know, electricity is going to win out there. It'd be interesting if all the electricity is generated from hydrogen, but there we go.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a very good note to open it up to the floor on. Do you have any questions from the audience for this panel? One in the front, yes, absolutely. No, you've got a microphone on the way.
Hello. Hi, I'm Tom Moody from the British High Commission. I just wanted to ask you a question about the challenge for Singapore being a price taker, I suppose, on hydrogen, because it's such a small power user relatively around the world. And most other countries, I think, will be thinking, first of all, about electrification for their power supply. So what do you think Singapore can be doing in terms of looking across the different industries, in terms of being a maritime hub, being an aviation hub, to help address that sort of scaling demand issue? And then connected to that, do you think there are particular technology areas that we need to encourage investment in that are sort of common across those themes? So, I mean, Thomas, in your slide at the start, it seemed to me that the sort of conversion area was an area that we really need to focus in on. But welcome thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I can take the first one probably, where I think on the scaling up, I think most of the announcements last week, I think are very welcome, because that gives a certain amount of certainty of the direction. And I think Singapore did the same thing with LNG when they basically a few years back mandated use and then gave out contacts to BG and Shell eventually. But I think the reality is also that Singapore market is a limited market, I think, in terms of the immediate uses. Because if I look at immediate uses, there is obviously Jurong Island, which has certain amount of hydrogen use, and there is obviously the power generation. But those are probably the total demand at this point in time is so limited that basically what Singapore can do is work together with the ASEAN countries in trying and develop an infrastructure, as well as trying and develop certain framework. Because focusing too much on itself, I think that's never going to bring the price down. Also, I think if the portion of this demand, and look, nothing against Australia, but if part of it can come from some of the emerging markets, I think what I've been seeing, and I think Japan, I think is a great example which it's doing, it's working with a lot of these JVs with Southeast Asian countries, South Asian countries, try to bring in technology, offer a certain amount of offtake to commercialize those projects. And I think so Singapore can maybe also consider how it can incentivize some of these ASEAN projects to come up. And if that can happen, that would benefit the entire region as well as Singapore.
Yeah, right. I mean, I do see that the Singapore government Overseas Week has announced many of such policies, right? I mean, they are looking at long-term planning. I mean, engaging the local government is obvious that they have thought about pricing issue front and center. They are working very closely with industry to better understand the supply chain, to also formulate their own strategy behind addressing such pain points. I mean, Singapore is a small market eventually. That's a reality of the situation. But do see that if done at the right time, especially in the early days, there would be certainly some benefit as the first mover from a demand center perspective that would simulate demand, supply for low carbon hydrogen.
Yeah, and there's some interesting questions about price taker versus price driver. I mean, you know, it's the world's third largest bunking location, and that's a very precious industry to Singapore, and it wouldn't want that to change. So in some senses, I guess Singapore, the shipping market and what happens in the shipping market. So I feel like, you know, Singapore can influence that. Other markets it can have more sovereign control over, you know, power generation. And I think, you know, that long-term statement about 50% of our power generation is going to come from hydrogen by the middle of the century kind of says to everyone, okay, well, when your current fleet of CCGT retires, your replacement fleet has got to be hydrogen ready. That's what that statement really means. And how that hydrogen gets here and what the price of that hydrogen is a different conversation. But, you know, if everyone knows that that's where it's going to come from, there's a certain price equity across all of that. And Singapore can be in control of some of those things.
Yeah, it comes back to that same principle of sort of setting that long-term target, pointing the way, right? And then letting the industry come in and follow suit and make the investment. Any other questions from the floor? Or I should say, Sarah, is there anything coming in on the Slido? We've got two. Okay, so maybe you can read them out, or Celia can read them out.
One about Sid mentioned the need for defining demand as an important step in project viability. What steps should governments take to help define industry demands?
Yeah, we've basically talked about it. I think what governments can do is, I think, to mandate the use of hydrogen. I mean, to be honest, there is no other way to put it. And in industries where they are taking majority of burden in terms of, or already providing subsidies, and I think that can go towards it, or to push certain industries. I think because eventually, I think the challenge in use of hydrogen, why there is no demand, let's touch on it. I think it is expensive. We are in an inflationary world, everything, and I think governments are in a difficult situation. You can't necessarily, I think we talked about Singapore electricity prices, and you know, it's Singapore, we still pay that, but there are certain countries where people get down on the road if the prices go there. So obviously governments have their limitations, but I think if you cannot bring down the cost of hydrogen immediately, I think, through tech subsidies, etc. I think it's obviously open up certain industries, require certain mixing so that it does not hit entirely. And I think that's the obvious way. And to be honest, there are two levers usually government has, which is, I think, either the tax credits or basically subsidies. And I think one of the two, I think the governments which can afford it, I think needs to probably use it to spur the demand.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's the third lever, which is the non-financial one, which is just a requirement to use it, right? So, I guess there are some markets where that could be done, right? So you know, town's gas supply, just blend that grey hydrogen till eventually it's all green. And that could be something that is done. It's not used in vast volumes by lots of people. So I think the impact on the individual in Singapore might be quite limited, but the impact to at least have a hydrogen import terminal, and therefore the infrastructure and therefore some sort of industry that starts, could be a really big first step. Also on Jurong Island, there are some hydrogen users where their hydrogen use is fairly niche. They generate their own hydrogen, it's grey, and you know, the cost in the round of all their other costs might be quite small. You know, you could start to tax that when it's grey to a greater and greater extent. So there are certain areas where you could do that and eventually mandate that to be green.
Yeah, and if I can add just a point, I think you touched on a very interesting issue. I think even while the demand is not being created immediately, I think the investment in midstream infrastructure, I think that's critical, because if you have hydrogen import infrastructure ready, I think even the small volumes can actually, you can have early movers actually dig into a small player. So there can be PPP projects which are helping build the hydrogen or ammonia supply infrastructure. That can also be one way where demand is not immediately being put out, but path to demand is being cleared significantly.
Yeah, and giving that price signal is also a thing. I mean, you know, there are industries on Jurong Island that use natural gas as a supply. And so if you're going to start blending, you know, you have to let them know well in advance that they're going to need to either clean their supply when it comes to them, or they're going to need to change their process. And that will take time. But again, it comes back to that long distance statements.
I think we have one more question.
What are the hurdles to require fossil fuel burning power plants to capture carbon dioxide and produce hydrogen, salt, and hydrogen? How soon can we resolve these hurdles? Whether is it political or technical?
Can you repeat the question?
What are the hurdles to require fossil fuel burning power plants to capture CO2 and produce hydrogen? And how soon can we resolve them?
Right, okay. I mean, you know, post combustion capture of CO2 from fossil fuel power stations is challenging. It's possible. I think what a lot of the market seems to be going down, and that was kind of a focus maybe 10 years ago of the carbon capture market. What a lot of the market seems to be going down is pre-combustion capture of CO2, which essentially means the creation of hydrogen, so the splitting of a fossil fuel, the separation out of a CO2, and then the use of the hydrogen in combustion. What that gives you, usually, because that is an industrial process, that splitting, reformation process, there are a number of different technologies for that. That gives you usually a high pressure and high purity CO2 stream, which is much easier to deal with than a flue full of all sorts of different things, so a chimney belching out whatever, containing a lot of CO2, but also NOx and everything else. It's quite difficult to clean. So I think it's unlikely, actually, that is the way industry goes. We will phase out the fossil generation and move towards another generation. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree. What would be more obvious would be, for existing gas CCGT to look at gas blending. To tackle it pre-combustion than post-combustion, that would be a more obvious option. And as in the current newer gen CCGTs, most would have allowed quite a significant, up to 50% blend of hydrogen LNG gas blending. Of course, subject to the class types of CCGT. And most of the OEMs are also looking at developing 100% hydrogen compatible CCGTs. And I do see that that's probably where the industry should be gravitating towards. And if you're talking on other feedstock like coal, then that's the promise for ammonia coal combustion. I mean, subject to efficiency outcomes post the pilot studies by a lot of the Japanese power plants. But that do hold quite some promise.
Yeah, I mean, very banker answer. I mean, it just doesn't work today because we've looked at some projects. It's just too expensive. And the carbon tax that is required is enormous. I mean, to be honest, with the current technology, I think, and again, I'm not a technical expert, but when we looked at when we looked at how would a carbon capture would work, there needs to be a source of revenue. And the only source of revenue could be with a carbon tax or a carbon capture as a service. And the numbers required to make that work is humongous. So I think a pure power plant capture, I think, it's more sensible to actually retire your coal assets, which are in Asia almost end of the life assets. There are very few early life assets, unlike other than in Vietnam. So it's much easier to retire them. And then I think for gas, I think both Thomas and Fiona has made some great points. But with coal, economics doesn't work.
Thanks, Sid. I think while we haven't answered every question, I think we've given a pretty clear view of what some of the pathways could be for integrating hydrogen into the energy transition in a very practical way, and how that could be used to build resilience. We don't have time for any more questions, but we are going to ask each of the panelists to give us a final thought on what's happening next week. And if you could share one key message with policymakers who are going to be at COP27, what would it be? And I've been asked to also give my thoughts, so I will. They will not be related to hydrogen directly, but they will actually tie in, I think, very well to the discussion we've been having. And I think the message to leaders now for COP27 is very clear, and that is, you have to show bold and long-term leadership. And you have to set out what your clear plans are in a measurable way. Invest your resources as governments, those limited resources, in both building the capacity for climate change response, because climate change is now, and also in building the kinds of demonstration projects in areas of high vulnerability or high impact that solve multiple challenges at the same time. And this is something that you talked about earlier, is these goals of decarbonisation, building resilience together in this joined up way. So demonstrate that in the highest impact, highest vulnerability areas, and then others will come in. Thomas?
I mean, if I was to give one message, and I guess most of the climate negotiators know this very well, because that's what they always do, but it's don't worry about compromise. I think, it's always a compromise. Let's not throw out the good actions in the chasing of perfection, right? So that includes, for example, the completely kind of rubbishing blue hydrogen, for example. It allows a huge industry, the oil and gas industry, to maintain its activities through upstream, midstream, and downstream. Let's give long-term vision, and that would be the second message. We just need a long-term activity. We've now had in 2050, someone else can worry about it when I've retired messages. We now need okay, we're going to make these steps. And it's not that hard, because we've done it for EVs, for example. There's been some pretty bold statements on that. We can do it for other things, but compromise would be my message.
For me, simply is just more action, less talk.
You're true to your message. Look, I mean, I think it's really going to be a tough act, but if I have to say something, we really are trying to save climate for all 5-6 billion people, not for the 3 billion, 4 billion people only. So I think it's important to, I think you talked about compromise. I like to say it's balancing. But I think we need to have climate change, poverty alleviation. I think they need to go together. And we cannot basically deprive a certain section or certain population of their energy requirements. At the same time, I think people like us who can afford it, I think they should basically try and do more, not try and talk more, in trying to, I think, create the demand, I think would be the most obvious ending point of this discussion. But yeah, create demand for green fuels and the clean energy.
Well, thank you for that, and I want to thank the panel for all of their responses. I hope you'll join me in thanking this panel, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Celia.
Thank you to our panel. If you can just remain seated, and Thomas, if you can give us a few closing words. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you all for coming. Actually, my few closing words are really to talk about the series that we have been running over the last few days. We've had events in, and let me get my notes up here, Ho Chi Minh, Hong Kong, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and Manila, and Singapore, and we've had 25 experts like yourselves. Thank you very much for joining us. That's been much appreciated. We have one event left, how to ensure a energy resilient future in economies of the future, which will be in Manila tomorrow. You can still sign up for that online. QR code there is on the side. And as Poya said, this is supported by UN FCCC Climate Champions. So I hope you will join us in thanking everyone for their inputs. And you can watch all of those events again, whatever your particular interests are. It ranges across quite a number of different areas, from flood risk to resilient transport. Thank you all, and please join me outside for some drinks and refreshments.